what would you do for a banana? Hi, hello, and salutations. My name is Perfect, and welcome to the funny internet review show I do every once in a blue moon because the universe thinks it's funny when my kneecaps have been kicked in backwards. All jokes aside, though, I do want to apologize for how long it's been since the last main episode, and then subsequently apologize for the 2 episodes I've since put on hold. Life has not been kind to me these last 2 years, but I'm still rolling with the punches because if there's anything, I'm a persistent little cockroach. I know I promised a Sonic series retrospective, and don't worry, that's still on the docket. In fact, I'm well into Sonic 2's video. But before I uploaded any of those, I wanted to just do a few non-Sonic related videos, just because I didn't want to fall into the trap of only being able to talk about one thing. I need to be able to talk about other things, damn it! So what am I going to talk at you about today? I mean, after all, isn't this why this series exists? Well, today we're going to be taking a dive into Donkey Kong territory. Specifically, we're going to be covering the Donkey Kong Country games, and maybe Donkey Kong 64 if I have the stamina for it.
Well, I've established myself as a massive Mario and Sonic fan. I don't have to talk about my third love, Donkey Kong. I freaking love this funny ape and his massive adopted family. Are they adopted? I mean, it makes the most sense to me. I don't know how Donkey Kong and Diddy Kong would be related by blood, seeing as they're 2 entirely separate animals. But hey, sometimes life just works in mysterious ways.
Family tree questions aside, I'm actually pretty excited to finally talk about this series, although I was kind of hoping there'd be a new Donkey Kong game announced before this. Just perfect timing and all that.
We're somewhat in a bit of a lull period for Donkey Kong right now. This isn't really anything new for the franchise though. Historically, Donkey Kong has always gone through these periods of dormancy, though I don't think it's ever been this long. If we're not counting the Mario vs. Donkey Kong remake, it's been over 10 years since the last major Donkey Kong release. That's insane!
I've grown tired of waiting for a new Donkey Kong game, so I don't know, maybe this mini-series will summon a new one into existence. Anyways, I don't know how to transition to the next point, so, party time!
Donkey Kong Country released back in November 12, 1994 to a rousing success. The game was a partnership between Rareware and Nintendo. Nintendo wanted a game to one-up Disney's Aladdin on the Sega Genesis, as they had learned that part of the game was getting special treatment, and it just so happened that Rare had just what they were looking for. Donkey Kong Country was revolutionary in a lot of ways. One, the technology used to make the game was cutting edge, taking 3D models and compressing them down into images that can be used as sprites by the Super Nintendo, and second, it was really the first of its kind visually. Not many games really looked like Donkey Kong Country. Well, at least not many games did on platforms that were widely available. I'm sure there was some game on some obscure platform that looked pretty similar visually, but as far as the mainstream was concerned, this was the first of its kind. At least, that's what everyone says. I don't know if you could tell, but I wasn't exactly around during the Super Nintendo's heyday. I may be old, but I'm not that old. This game predates my existence by a good few years. Yeah, as someone who was not alive during the 90s, I don't really have any sort of nostalgic attachment to it. Well, I mean, I am nostalgic for the game, but in like a different way. I don't really remember this as the game that put Nintendo back over Sega in the market. No, in fact, my first experience with Donkey Kong Country was via the often forgotten Game Boy Color port.
A lot of you are probably just now finding out that, yes, there was actually a direct port of Donkey Kong Country to the Game Boy Color.
Yeah, that's right, not from Donkey Kong Land or what have been actually relevant to my time, the Game Boy Advance port. No, somehow, someway, I ended up getting my hands on the Game Boy Color port. Donkey Kong Country for Game Boy Color, unlike Donkey Kong Land, is just a straight up no-nonsense port. For some reason, the game uses a lot of Donkey Kong 64 elements, like the menu select, and on the very rare occasion when Donkey Kong has a voice, it's a heavily compressed Grant Kirkhope. Other than that though, it's Donkey Kong Country with not as good visuals, not as good music, and certainly not as good gameplay. Much like Donkey Kong Land, this is only an approximation of how Diddy and Donkey Kong controlled in the original. The physics here are nowhere near as good. Back in the day, I'm sure this was a great alternative to the SNES original, allowing people to play the game on the go, but as I said earlier, I was a kid by the time that the GBA port of Donkey Kong Country was made, so we already had the better way to play the game. Is there any reason to check out these versions of Donkey Kong Country nowadays? Outside of novelty, not really. I mean, the GBA port, which I won't be talking about in this video, has some added cutscenes and some new sound effects, but if you own a Switch or heck, even a new 3DS system, then there's really no reason to play these versions.
It wouldn't be until the Wii Virtual Console where I'd finally play the true Donkey Kong Country, and that's when I truly fell in love with the game. It's not that I already didn't like Donkey Kong, no, in fact I was obsessed with the character because I was also just coincidentally obsessed with Donkey Kong 64 and anything that had to do with Rare and Nintendo at the time. It's kind of funny though because I was absolutely terrible at it. It took me about a full year just to get past the first few worlds. But yeah, for this video we're going to be using the Nintendo Switch Online part of the game. Why? I don't know, it's just most convenient, I guess.
It all begins on one stormy night. The dastardly King K. Rool and his Kremling army have set their sights on taking over Donkey Kong Island, and also wanted to steal the precious banana hoard that belongs to the titular Donkey Kong. Diddy Kong was set to keep an eye on the banana hoard that night, and the Kremlings used this opportunity to strike, easily taking care of the tiny primate and locking him away in a barrel. The Kremlings, within the span of a single night, are able to steal Donkey Kong's entire hoard of bananas and establish a functioning military-industrial system.
Now that's what I call efficiency.
Donkey Kong, waking up in the morning and seeing how his island has been made a mess of, is relatively chill with it, oddly enough. That is until he checks on his banana hoard to see that it's been pilfered. Now it's become personal. Breaking Diddy Kong free of his embarrassing predicament, the two set out to beat up King K. Rool.
You know, it's funny, as a kid I never actually noticed that the name was King K. Rool. I always pronounced it King Cruel. That was just a funny little anecdote, I thought. The story of Donkey Kong Country isn't really complex, but it doesn't really need to be. It's just a funny, jumpy game starring the funny ape.
Review of the century right there, honestly. But yeah, this is an adventure starring Donkey Kong and newcomers to the series Diddy Kong, Candy Kong, Funky Kong, and Cranky Kong. Cranky Kong used to be the original Donkey Kong, but then the mantle got handed down to his next of kin. Turns out the modern incarnation of Donkey Kong is actually Donkey Kong Jr. Well, in this game at least anyways. Nintendo and even Rare themselves have always been sort of wishy-washy about whether or not modern Donkey Kong is actually DK Jr. or DK Jr.'s son. Like, for example, in this game it's DK Jr., but in Donkey Kong 64, which takes place in the same continuity, Donkey Kong in that game is actually Cranky Kong's son, which would make this DK Donkey Kong Jr.'s dad. Speaking of Cranky Kong, I love this old codger. He's always complaining and he gets pretty meta with his complaints. Like how in his debut cutscene, he complains about there being too many colors and how he had to deal with an 8x8 sprite tile limit. Funky Kong's a pretty rad dude. I don't have footage of him because I completely forgot to get any. It's alright though, he's not as useful in this game as he will be later on. Candy Kong is DK's love interest. Sometimes she's his girlfriend, other times they're not. Again, it depends on the game here. She lets you save your progress though, so that's pretty useful. Finally on our list of Kongs, we have Diddy Kong, Donkey Kong's sidekick. Originally, this was supposed to be DK Jr., but Nintendo felt that the design was such a radical departure from anything DK Jr. that they felt it would be better just to make him his own character entirely. And honestly, Diddy Kong is a much preferable sidekick than Donkey Kong Jr., if I'm being honest. And I guess Nintendo agrees, considering how after DKC, DK Jr.'s appearance in games starts to become less and less. Listen, I don't hate DK Jr., just his inclusion in anything outside of Donkey Kong always felt like he was meant to be more like a stand-in for DK and not an option for those who like Donkey Kong Jr., if that makes any sense. Like in Super Mario Kart, DK Jr. is playable, but it really feels like he's only there because his sprite was less complicated to draw on a go-kart.
Anyway, let's start blabbing about characters, let's start blabbing about the gameplay.
Donkey Kong Country may have Donkey Kong in the title, but this is a radical departure from the arcade games. Instead of adapting the arcade original into a modern twist, Rare opted to take inspiration from the Mario series and turn the franchise into a 2D platformer. As I said earlier, in this adventure you get to not only play as Donkey Kong, but Diddy Kong as well, and both have their own unique traits to ensure they don't end up blending into one another. Donkey Kong is a heavy character. It takes him a bit to build up to top speed, and he's a lot slower to stop. The trade-off to all this is that he's able to take down pretty much any enemy that comes his way. Very few exist that he can't simply just get rid of by crushing their spines when landing on them. He's also pretty useful for more precise platforming. Diddy Kong, on the other hand, is light and fast. It doesn't take much for him to reach top speed, and he stops on a dime. The trade-off for that is that he can't take down heavy enemies on his own, and his speed can make him pretty unruly for moments of precision. I really like how both play here though, and they both have plenty of opportunity to show off their strengths. Although most likely Diddy Kong will be your favorite to play as.
I mean, it makes sense. Diddy Kong plays a lot like Mario does, so it tends to lend itself to people preferring to play as him over Donkey. Although, being honest, as the time has gone on, I've actually come to prefer playing as Donkey Kong. I've seen a lot of people throw crap towards Donkey Kong's playstyle, and honestly, it's just kind of overblown. It's not like switching to DK suddenly makes the game hard mode. No, the game is designed to be comfortable with either Kong.
But fun to play characters don't mean squat if the level design is bad. Luckily, that's not a problem for DKC. These levels are all well designed and offer a lot in the ways of secrets and collectibles. First, we have the Kong letters. Collect all 4 and you'll get a life. Then we have these animal statues, which are based off of the animal pals that appear in some levels. Collect 3 of those and you'll be taken to a bonus stage filled to the brim with small collectibles to really rack up that life counter. Really, that is what all these secrets amount to. They're just here to bolster your life counter. But hey, those secrets at times will really test your wit and your abilities to maneuver the Kongs though. They're really satisfying to find. Although it is unfortunate to say that these secrets secrets really do add a lot to the complexity of these levels, because if you don't care to find them, then the stages can be a tad on the safe side. Donkey Kong Country is surprisingly pretty tame with its use of gimmicks, especially for the time period it was in. Now, it's not like the levels don't have anything going on. Occasionally you'll run into the aforementioned animal pals, and they sort of act like Yoshi, adding on to your character's abilities. We have Rambi the Rhino, On Guard the Swordfish? I believe Swordfish. Looks more like a tuna to me. Winky the Frog, and Espresso the Ostrich.
And before anyone says anything, no, we're not talking about Squawks. He's not helpful, he gives me seizures.
Rambi, as his name implies, can be used to ram into things. Obstacles, enemies, secret walls. He's pretty useful in the levels he appears in. On Guard appears in water levels and is extremely useful there. His swim handling is very good, and he becomes a great offensive tool in levels where you can't do much against your opponents. Winky mainly appears in mining levels, but he can appear from time to time in cave and regular jungle levels. He's probably the least useful of them all, to be honest. Sure, his extra jump height is nice at times, and he does have the ability to take out zingers still, but I'm never excited to see him. Espresso, I just flat out don't like. Sure, they have the super running speed, but that doesn't really matter, seeing as how they can't even land on enemies to take them out, and on top of that, they only appear in levels where they feel more like an active detriment than anything else. Luckily, all these animals pals are optional, so if you don't like one, you don't need to use it. You just might miss out on a secret or two.
Since the animal pals are built more like Yoshi, that means that there really aren't levels built around them. That doesn't mean they don't exist, but we already agreed not to talk about Squawks.
Honestly, the lack of any level gimmicks is something I've seen levied against this game time and time again, as if this is some real problem that plagues Donkey Kong Country. Not to get too much into the sequels here, but this is something that Donkey Kong Country 2 and Donkey Kong Country 3 really go out of their way to remedy. But to be honest with you all, I'm not really too bothered by the lack of gimmicks. I don't think there's anything wrong with a good set of just solid levels with nothing fancy to them. One thing I will hold this game accountable for, though, is the disjointed difficulty. The majority of the game is fairly comfortable for the most part. You'll probably rarely find the levels any amount of challenging, but then every once in a while the game will just throw an insurmountable brick wall at you for seemingly no reason other than it just being funny. And these situations are why you're given a metric butt ton of lives, whether it be a fairly relaxed level with a ton of think fast enemy placements at the end, or dickish design meant to really push your patience. There will be moments of utter frustration. Circling back on gimmicks here, while the game may be short on that end, it's got atmosphere in abundance. Throughout our adventure in the weirdly DK-like island, we'll encounter many different biomes, each with their own specific platforming set pieces. The jungle theme itself is essentially this game's equivalent to the ground theme in Mario Brothers. This is the de facto level theme, so it doesn't have much going for it that other levels don't. The next level theme is the cave theme. These tend to be my least favorite of them. I'm sure most people forget that these are actual dedicated levels and not just transition screens between level chunks. Sucks that there are so many of them towards the end. We've also got a jungle temple theme. This one's alright. I really like the concept of these naughties riding in giant hamster wheels as obstacles. There's also this treetop village theme. I love treetop villages as a concept, so I really like this one a lot. It also reminds me a lot of the Ewok village in the original Star Wars Battlefront 2. This thing probably uses the barrel cannons and tire springs the most. Then we have the mine theme. This one appears somewhat frequently and is where the minecart levels are found. I actually want to briefly talk about the minecart sections here for a moment. Is it just me, or are the hitboxes pretty jank in these levels? Like, it's really hard to tell if I'm going to jump over an obstacle or if I'm going to hit it, which is a problem because these later levels require you to get so close to oncoming obstacles to make a jump. I do like the switch up they do halfway through though, where instead of making the cart jump, the Kongs are jumping from cart to cart. There are also those levels with the on and off switches here. Those tend to make me tense as heck. We also have these underwater levels. These operate under similar logic as the water levels in Super Mario Brothers, where instead of swimming, you're constantly being dragged to the bottom and you need to jump to maintain your position. In these levels, you're completely defenseless against pretty much everything, which is why On Guard is so extremely useful in these levels. Honorable mention to this specific water level here. I really love the color of it. Next up are these factory levels. This theme is pretty neat, but I feel like it's rather underutilized. From my memory, I don't really remember encountering this one a lot. These tend to be some of the tougher levels though, like that one level with the platforming on top of fire barrels that have weird damage timers. We also have the forest theme. This one doesn't appear all that often, and it tends to be just like the jungle theme. Up next, we have the snow theme. It's your pretty typical snow level. Ice physics, snowstorms, the works. These appear pretty much in one world only. Finally, we have the ice caverns. This theme appears in a singular level, but honestly, it's my favorite. I'm already a sucker for snow levels, but slap that inside a cave with icicles and pretty crystals, and yeah, it's a recipe for my favorite theme. The level itself is also pretty fun with the gimmick of these pulley ropes moving you up and down. I assume these are pulley ropes because I don't know how else they would be making the Kongs move like this. The worlds are typically themed around the levels that appear in them the most, but it's not dictative of what will actually appear.
Speaking of worlds, while they all might be different in aesthetics, You want to know something they all have in common with? Extremely underwhelming boss fights.
Yeah, most of the bosses in this game are pretty lame, all things considered. It doesn't help that 2 of them are repeats. These are the worst type of platformer bosses, ones that don't really test your abilities or skills that you've obtained throughout the world. It's rather just a big enemy you need to hit more than once. Shout out to Dumb Drum for literally doing the hard work for us and just going, you know what, screw this.
But it's alright in the end, because the final King K. Rool fight totally makes up for the lame bosses.
This fight is really good. It's a complete test of skill, putting you up against some tight as hell platforming and dodge sections. I still find the fake-out ending so hilarious, and we even have this kick-ass music worthy of the Kremlin King himself blasting on in the background. Speaking of the music, that's probably something else you'll recognize from this game. The visuals weren't the only thing that set this game apart from its competition. Usually at the time, video game music would sound something more akin to this. And then comes along Donkey Kong Country with music that sounded like this. At the very same time, while nothing looked quite like Donkey Kong Country, nothing quite sounded like it either. The music is very subdued and ambient. It's not really something you would think of when discussing video game music at the time. The music was so good that people would claim that it was something you could play on the radio and no one would bat an eye, and I agree. My personal favorite tracks in no particular order are DK Island Swing, a classic, Fear Factory, Gangplank Galleon, and of course, as natural as breathing is, aquatic ambience. The music in this game really helps bolster the atmosphere. Anyways, with that tangent out of the way, let's finish off that dastardly monarch. And that was Donkey Kong Country. I love the credits of this game because they give you the roll call of not just the people who worked on the game, but also the enemies. I miss when games did this. I hate not knowing what enemies are called in games. The ending bit where Donkey Kong and Diddy Kong harass each other will never not be funny to me.
Honestly, the game still holds up pretty well even by today's standards. I know it's a bit on the safer side and most people do deride it for its lack of gimmicks, but honestly, I don't really mind a good platformer that's no nonsense. If you're looking for a great way to spend a few hours of your afternoon, Donkey Kong Country is a great way to spend those hours. If you're thinking of replaying the game now because of this video, do it! But yeah, that's gonna do it for this video. Next time we're gonna be talking about the wildly more popular Donkey Kong Country 2. But until then, have a great rest of your day.